Let me do that. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen. I'm gonna ask you to let me know if you can see it. Let's see. Oh, can you make me like a host, because it says disable screen sharing.
Yeah, I clicked on the button and it says that multiple people can share.
Oh,
So
okay.
let me.
Oh, now I can.
Oh, okay. Cool. Thank you.
And if you can cameras on, so if you're asking, that would be pretty cool. Later on, we're gonna do some breakout rooms. So just giving you, in advance that you're gonna have to talk to like some people in a like smaller group. All right, perfect. So you can see my screen with the presentation slides. Yeah.
Yes.
All right, awesome, thank you. Okay. All right, well, you guys heard the introduction. It's pretty cool to see you today. Again, my name is Zainab. My pronouns are she, her, and today we're going to be discussing decolonial psychology. This is something that has been kind of in the rise in psychology, and so I feel like it's really important for us to have a quick introduction and just kind of dismantle and understand what that means and what it entails. All right. If anyone has any questions, please just type them in the chat box and I'll either answer them or we'll discuss them at the end, okay? And I cannot see the chat box, so if there's something important, please just like speak up and let me know as well.
I can also send you any questions they have via the chat box, or I can save it towards the end, whatever you prefer.
All right, perfect. Whatever works, great. All right. So before we begin, I'd like to make a land acknowledgement that we are on I am on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present, and honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. And what we're discussing real quick. So the first thing is some definitions. So what is colonialism? What is decolonial psychology? All of that. And then we're going to go into the history of psychology and the idea of Eurocentrism. We're quickly going to discuss critical consciousness and what that means. And then finally, talk about decolonial methods into practice. So based on what we learned, how can we incorporate that into practice? And just a quick thing about me. My name is Zainab. I am Arab or Arab. I'm also North African, specifically Egyptian. I'm a cisgendered female. I'm also able-bodied and neurotypical. I'm a Muslim. I'm also an immigrant. I speak 2 languages, Arabic and English, and I'm financially secure. So based on what I said with the identity, I'll ask people to mute themselves just because to make sure we can hear each other correctly. So that would be pretty cool. So based on what I talked about on my own identities, I want you to take a moment and think about what are some intersecting parts of your identities? What are you showing up with today? Just take a moment to think about it. If anyone would like to share in the chat box, that would be awesome as well. Nope. Would anyone like to share what are kind of parts of their different identities and what they're showing up with today?
I'm Salome, showing up as a mom and as a Latina.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for the introduction. Anyone else kind of would like to share? Why settler Canadian?
Aaron shares that in the chat box that white settler Canadian.
Okay, thank you, Aaron. All right, so just think about that and kind of try to reflect on your different identities throughout this training. All right, so let's start with some definitions. Thomas, biracial, Filipino, and white, cisgender male. Thank you for sharing. So let's start with some definitions. First, what is colonialism? And this is kind of like a textbook sort of definition. It's kind of like, this is what the research says. And I want you to also take it with a grain of salt and kind of think about it in your own terms and think about what that means. So typically colonialism is when one ethnic or cultural group subjugates another, which results in the destruction and loss of social patterns, traditions, power, prestige, self-respect, language, culture, and autonomy. So basically a confluence of profound negative social and emotional consequences. So when this happens, there's a simultaneous elevation of such dominant Western European groups, as well as their cultural mores. So in contrast, what does decolonizing entail? It entails the meaningful and active resistance to the forces of colonialism that perpetuate the subjugation and or exploitation of our minds, bodies, and lands. So basically what we want to do is identify what's not working and then restore some community-based Indigenous perspectives where we highlight the importance of love, relationships, Indigenous knowledge, and local approaches to wellness, responsibility, identity, and the land or earth in community wellness. When we're gonna go over the psychology and the history of psychology, you would notice the switch of psychological research being scientific. And what that entails is a lot of scientific methods that doesn't talk about Indigenous healing. It doesn't talk about and it doesn't cover Indigenous people. And so that's what I want you to think about as we're going through this. So when we're trying to reach somewhere with an Indigenous perspective or decolonizing perspective, we want to see how contemporary psychological science and psychological theories of cultural identity and human development are the legacy of colonialism, Orientalism, and Eurocentric assumptions. So how is the psychology we know today? How is the science of psychology and those theories that we've been studying ever since that Psych 101 in undergrad, how are they linked to colonialism? How are they linked to Eurocentric assumptions? And this is something, or at least for me, that I haven't learned either in undergrad or grad school in my psych study. I'll ask people to mute their mics again. Thank you. So therefore, decolonization involves understanding and documenting the process of colonization and how it impacts people in the past and in the present. So think about families, think about nations, the idea and the concept of nationalism in general. Think about institutions and knowledge productions. What does the research say in psychology? What does that mean? What is the research built on? Who are the populations that the research is addressing? Is it a strictly white middle-class population? Or what kind of population is it? And then finally, we want to disrupt that traditional research process. We want to be able to make space for Indigenous knowledge, storytelling, and oral history as forms of valid knowledge, forms of art, community knowledge, and lived experiences. With the development of psychology, there's been this distinction between what is quote unquote valid, what is quote unquote a good place of knowledge where we can kind of draw theories, and what is a not good or not valid. So I want you to rethink about that, and I want you to kind of disrupt that traditional process that we've learned. All right, so this is a pretty cool picture. So these are called Decolonize Displaced activists. They are activists who are going in Egyptian galleries of an art museum, and they're questioning how those artifacts actually came to the museum. So they say, how is this acquired, by whom, for whom, at whose cost? And while this is not directly related to psychology, I want you to think about that picture. Think about those questions. How were specific things acquired? Who acquired them, and for who did they acquire? And kind of try to have that knowledge into what you know as the study of psychology and what you know as the quote unquote science of psychology. All right. And then this is a quick thing on anti-racist scholarship. So this relates more to research over practice, but I feel like it's really, really good to understand what an anti-racist scholarship entails or a decolonizing perspective entails. Does anyone have any questions? Sorry, excuse me, till now before I go further. All right, perfect. So basically, anti-racist scholarship is not just a political or a racialized stand. but it's a grounding that recognizes our structures and systems and processes of society. What they're doing is that they're battling this 500-year appropriation of every intellectual strategy, political ideology, etc. Basically, what happens is those kind of appropriations that were happening, they form a reality that goes unquestioned and violently punishes those who question it. So therefore, anti-racist scholarship or applications in practice or in mentorship, it questions the very fabric of knowledge and knowledge production and challenges the very givens of the known world. So it's the idea of questioning those things that we quote unquote see as, oh, this is how it is. This is proven. This is a theory. This is behaviorism. This is cognitive behavioral therapy. This is everything that we've known. And kind of dismantling that and thinking, based on what did you get to that theory? So this is a really cool kind of definition contrast. Just a disclaimer, a lot of the things I'm presenting to you today is from a conference at Columbia University on decolonizing psychology. And what they did is that they actually have all the slides and all the live recordings available to everyone. So if you just write Decolonizing Psychology Columbia, you'll access the website, you don't need to pay anything, and you'll find all the slides, all the transcripts, and all the videos for everyone. So it's a very, very cool thing. But basically, one of the presenters, Dr. Amanda Sullivan, was presenting the difference between these words. Usually, the words diversity, inclusion, equity, anti-racism, and decolonization are sometimes used interchangeably. People are like, oh yeah, we're diverse, and we're inclusive, and we're equitable, but you don't really know what that entails and what that means. So basically, she's talking about it as the idea that they're graduated efforts that subsume the previous ones. So for example, our basic level is the level of diversity and inclusion, where we're primarily concerned with presence or representation. We want to make sure that there's BIPOC individuals present. We want to make sure they're represented, but we're not approaching it with an eye towards disrupting or replacing oppressive systems. So it's about, okay, we're going to make sure there is a diversity hire, which sounds awful and not that good, but we're not thinking about disrupting that oppressive system that made it difficult for diverse individuals in the first place to be in the workplace. After that is equity. What happens with equity is often addressed in terms of outcomes or processes, but along with diversity and inclusion, it doesn't engage the nature of the work, meaning that we can pursue equity, you can even achieve it without substantively changing or disrupting white supremacy, without disrupting colonialism. So it's possible for a context to be diverse. It's possible for a context to be kind of equitable while still maintaining racism or white supremacy. And that's why people are moving towards more anti-racist and decolonial practices. So anti-racism and decolonial practices, they succeed those previous efforts. So they succeed equity, diversity, inclusion. But what makes them distinct is about confronting or changing those fabrics of society. So while anti-racism and decolonization are processes, the others are just goals. So our goal is providing one person to work in the workplace who's diverse. Anti-racism and decolonization, it's a process. It's a journey and a continual process where we're dismantling and we're kind of rethinking those oppressive symptoms. Does anyone have any questions about those kind of differences between the different words? I found it pretty cool, so I just wanted to share, but any questions about it? I'll take that as a no, but if there's any, please feel free to send it on the chat box. All right, so now we're going to the history of psychology. This is like a quick Google picture when you write quote unquote founding fathers of psychology. What can you observe? So if you're looking at that picture, talking about the finders of the beginnings, behaviorism, humanistic psychology, cognitive and behavioral psychology, what are some things you notice from the people who were like the founding fathers of psychology, which are usually taught in our Psych 101 classes? White males, all right? Older white men. Glasses. That's interesting but true. A lot of glasses.
they appear upper, white, middle class.
Mhm. Yeah. So as you guys said, upper middle class white men. And I want you to think about what that entails. So if a whole basically research, all of the science of the psychology is built upon is built upon white middle class men, who is it going to cater to? Probably the same. They're built upon the people that they know, the population they've been introduced to. So white middle class upper men. So this introduces us to the concept of psychology and Eurocentrism. There's been a lot of kind of talk about how Eurocentric psychology is, and it's traditionally derived from a white middle class value system. And some criticisms of general psychological theory include that psychology is culturally encapsulated and lacking in cross-cultural relevance, and that those counseling approaches, those approaches we get in grad school, those approaches we're taught when we first go into grad school, they've been developed by and for the white middle class person. It's based on Western individualistic terms, and it has the myth of sameness or the assumption of universality. But what does that mean? What is the assumption of universality? Let's say you're a new therapist, you just graduated grad school, you're given all these classes, you're given all these theories, group therapy, all of that. Sorry, excuse me. My breakfast is not dealing well, but that's okay. So you're given all of that. You start the therapy and then you operate from the assumption that such a theory base, the theories you've learned, can be applied to all populations because this is what you learned. So this is the myth of sameness, the idea that these theories can be applied to all populations. However, the truth is, what works for the white middle class men does not work for everyone else. And that's something that we kind of need to acknowledge and understand. So making psychology responsive to the needs of culturally different population requires a willingness to engage in examining the underlying cultural values that constitutes the basis of discipline. And so just also a quick recap over the beginning of psychology and what we've talked about is the idea of the non-Western as the other. And the other is an inferior and a primitive savage. And that has been cited in a lot of literature if you find into kind of older literature of how psychology was first formed. If you'd like, I can also provide you with those sources and you can kind of read a bit more into it. And then Euro-American roots of psychology have historically prioritized thinking and practices that have supported apartheid and colonization through the body of knowledge referred to as scientific racism. So some people argue that Euro-American psychologists actually contributed to legitimizing slavery, to legitimizing colonization, apartheid, and the genocide of millions of Africans and colonized people from all around the world. And these arguments have really, really good basis. And so it's important for us as therapists, as the people who hold the power in the therapy room, to understand where that comes from and to understand how that entails when we're working with our clients. Decolonization entails understanding that larger racialized history of the discipline and how the story of a concept is narrated. So just a quick also recap of making explicit those dimensions underlying the Eurocentric psychology. When we talked, we said that white culture serves as the foundation for counseling theory, research, and practice. So what I want us to do real quick is examine the major components of white culture. So what are general components of white culture versus what are the general components, the culture dimensions of traditional counseling? How is traditional counseling perceived? So this is, I'm not sure if you can read it because it's a bit small. These are two tables from this really cool research paper that kind of shows both together for people to contrast. So it shows you first, the components of white culture, values and beliefs. And second, the components of counseling, values and beliefs. So let's take an example and see if they're kind of similar. Let me try to annotate. Yeah, all right. Okay, perfect. So if we think about the individualism in white culture, what does individualism look like? It looks like the individual is the primary unit. There's primary responsibility for the individual. How about in counseling? In counseling, it's seen as the individual is the primary focus and has the primary responsibility. If you go through the list, just for the sake of time, we're not going to be able to go through it together, but I advise you to do it. It's fascinating. and kind of compare the components of white culture versus the components of of counseling psychology, you'd basically see that they're kind of equals. They're kind of derived from each other. And so it's important to understand that and to kind of understand what that entails and what that means. All right. Does anyone have any comments about the similarities that they can see? So just think about them, have them in your mind, but they're very, very interesting to see. And hoping that when you see those, you understand where the call for decolonization comes from. You understand how much psychology is affected by that. I'll go to the next slide for the sake of time. All right, this is another just quick table, and it kind of shows you how historically some psychological explanations of social and political issues have been. For example, hysteria. Back then in psychology, the subjugation of women was actually explained by hysteria, that women can get hysterical. And that was something that at the time was actually believed. Previous DSMs, the idea of queer identities and the idea of the LGBT community and the idea of being attracted to the same sex, that was seen as a mental illness in the DSM until very recently. And so it begs the question of, why does psychology try to explain things in that manner? It's important to think about it, because that doesn't make any sense. Why is that a mental illness? Why are women hysterical? So this is a table that kind of goes over different things. So for example, there's the cultural problem of poverty and academic achievement. What people see, or how psychology explains it, is that there's no self-regulation. So they disregard the idea that a child is born in poverty. They disregard the social implications, the cultural implications, and think about it in terms of, oh, you just need to have better self-esteem. Oh, you just need to have better self-regulation and control yourself. The same is for families of non-Western cultures or marginalization. It's explained as, oh, you just need to incorporate a bit more self-care. You're not marginalized. You're not in a bad situation. You're not oppressed. You just need to incorporate more self-care and all will be well. And that's not what we want. All right, so this goes to the idea of critical consciousness. I provided like a hopefully quick kind of overview of the history of psychology, how is psychology developed? And I'm hoping that this shows you where this is coming from, where the need for decolonization is coming from. So the concept of critical consciousness is the idea of becoming aware of and thoughtfully problematizing our lived experiences and the social political environment, such as exposure to racism, and then engaging in targeted actions in response to that critical reflection. This includes being aware of social inequalities and action towards dismantling systems of power, privilege, and oppression. We want to generate that social change at the various levels of societal organization. What does critical consciousness include? It includes the ability to recognize and challenge oppressive and dehumanizing political, economic, and social systems. One might ask, be like, well, I'm just an individual. Like, what can I actually do? As a therapist, you can actually do a lot by starting to do that in the therapy space, which is by accountability, reflecting on and taking responsibility for examining our own worldviews, biases, and assumptions in supervision and clinical work. So how we perceive differences, multicultural factors, and power. And I kind of want to think about those identities you mentioned at the beginning that you showed up with. And what is the accountability you can do? What are your own worldviews and biases and assumptions that you need to examine in your clinical work that go into that? So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go into breakout rooms. What I want us to do is, based on that information I gave you, based on that quick and brief overview, I want us to think about what are some ways each of us can have some decolonial methods incorporated into practice. So before we do that, I just want to introduce you to the person that I got this from. So they're this really, really cool therapist that I found, and I asked them if I have permission to, it was a blog post of how they decolonize methods into practice, and I asked them if they were okay, but they wanted me to give you a quick update for the post. There's been some, or actually a lot of criticism over the use of the word decolonizing as a metaphor. And they wanted to make it clear that they're describing their practices as justice and collective liberation oriented. And when we do decolonize, it must center Indigenous sovereignty and land. So I just wanted to put that disclaimer out there. If someone would like me to send you those articles that are pretty cool about using decolonizing as a metaphor and how we need to do better, please do let me know. So decolonizing practices are actions we can take, words we can say, and ideas we can learn, unlearn, relearn, or transform in order to transform those colonial impacts. So based on what we talked about, based on that critical consciousness, based on those truths of psychology, what are some things that you can do as a therapist in your practice to decolonize your practice, to kind of challenge those oppressive systems? We're going to be in breakout rooms of 4 to 5. I'll give you guys like, let's do 7-ish, 10 minutes or 7 minutes. You guys can discuss it together, and then we'll go back and kind of discuss it as the larger group. Does anyone have any questions before we begin? Think no? Okay, perfect. So you should.
I'm so sorry. Did you want to go into a room as well? Oh, you're muted.
You put me in a room, but I left just to give them the space to be able to talk. But thank you so much. I appreciate
Okay.
it.
And then I did receive a question earlier. Someone couldn't attend today's um, event, and so they asked if we would be also sharing the PowerPoint slides, the recording, and any resources. I told them yes to the recording, but that I would check with you about the PowerPoint slides and the resources.
Yeah, for sure. I'll do that.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And then just let me know when you're ready for me to bring everyone back.
All right, so let's bring them back at 12:35.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
How are you doing, by the way? Wait, hold on. Let me stop it. Wait, no, I can't stop the recording. I'm afraid that if I stop it, I won't be able to start it again.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm not too bad. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Just juggling, trying to make sure everything happens on time the way it's supposed to.
Mhm.
It's so cool. Thank you so much for bringing this. This is one of our largest groups. And so
Oh,
there
great.
was so much interest in being able to learn from you today. So thank you.
Thank you. I hope I was helpful. I'm not sure it is, but I hope I was helpful.
No, it is. This is phenomenal. And I please oh, you bit yourself. It's
Oh
okay.
no.
Yeah. She just started learning how to walk and do stuff, and so
Oh,
she's having a tough time.
such an adorable age, but it's really hard to manage.
Yeah, it is. Is that better? Do you feel better? Oh, you want the computer? How's life been though? I haven't spoken with you in months. What's
I
new?
know.
What's old?
It's been a while. I'm managing the Seattle winter. That's something that's very new to me, not having sun for.
Yeah.
But there was a nice weekend, so at least there's that. But yeah, how have you been?
Melina's also sharing how she's doing.
Oh,
She loves these Zoom gatherings because she gets to see people, and so she gets all happy and excited and just starts talking up a storm.
oh, very excited.
Hey, Elizabeth, did you need help with something?
Hi, sorry, I had to switch devices, but I was in room 3.
Room 3? Okay. Give me 1 second. You should be able to log in now. Okay, cool. Yeah. I am very grateful that it looks like winter is going to be ending sooner rather than later.
That's very exciting, to be honest.
Yeah, normally we get like a really long time of like we get like a short period of snow and then tons of rain and overcast, but it's been so different. Oh, hey Larissa, what can we do to support you?
Hey there, I'm just wondering if there's anyone in my breakout room. I don't seem to be able to connect.
Oh, you're not with Mary or Sandra?
Yes, those names sound familiar, but I couldn't hear anyone, and I'm not
Oh.
unable. Well, no one responded to a message either.
Okay, let me put you in breakout room 2.
Oh,
I'm just gonna check out breakout room 1 just to make sure everything's working okay.
Go ahead. Thank you so much.
Let me see. Hi everyone. I'm just checking in, seeing how the group's going. You can always chat in the chat box if you'd like. Hello?
It's so weird when you left, it said recording stopped. I'm wondering if that's because you left to the breakout room, but now it's.
Yeah, it restarted in the breakout room. Yeah, I don't think they're there. And so I'm like, I'm hopeful that other people are
Oh,
there in
wow.
their rooms.
Well, we
Um,
can let them back in a minute. We're almost
yeah,
there.
yeah, 2 more minutes.
I feel like breakout rooms can be a hit or a miss sometimes, but let's hope it was a hit for some people.
Yeah, no, that's so true. I'm gonna see if there's a way for me to message everyone saying, hey, we're gonna be pulling back in a minute. Let me figure out these settings. Yeah. Oh, yes, I know.
All right, I think we should be ready. It's 12:35.
Okay, give me one moment. Let me pull up the breakout rooms button again.
Thank you so much for the help, by the way.
Oh, yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate you letting me do this today. I close the rooms. It says all breakout rooms will close in 55 seconds.
All
Sorry. I didn't realize I had to push the button and then it would go. I should have pushed it when I gave the 1 minute warning.
right. Breakout rooms are interesting to navigate.
They are. And this one's very different than what I'm used to working with. Usually if I just say I hit the button, it ends. So they modified the settings, which is good. That's a good thing.
I feel that. Well, people are coming in, so that's perfect. So thank you so much for the help.
Wonderful.
All right, so I think everyone's here. Probably just take a moment to kind of discuss what you guys talked together in breakout room. Just a couple of people. So if anyone wants to go, please just go ahead.
I think I can share. So something that came up, Isabel and I were talking about how first of all, I felt like I needed more time to process what I'd been learning to then try to understand and to then decide, you know, sort of action-wise things that I could do. But the one thing that did come up was how, for me, it sort of helped me just understanding this and having it laid out this way, helped me to understand one of the things that I've been struggling with and that I didn't identify as something that I'd been struggling with. So I manage a behavioral health clinic for children and family. And our population is that we cater to is mostly Latinos, and they, you know, a lot of Spanish speakers. And, you know, when you work with children and families, you work with the parents, and there's so much, it's hard when you get so much pushback about like, well, in Mexico, it was different, or our culture is not like this. And so coming here and then trying to work with, you know, the traditional tools that we're given and the way that we're taught to do CBT and all these things that I, you know, didn't realize were so rooted in a lot of these values. And I knew there was a difference, but I guess this just really helped understand why it's so hard for our therapists to find something that is really helpful to bridge that huge gap, that cultural gap between the first generation kids that are being raised here in the US and then the parents who are not and have an entirely different culture and are trying to instill that in them. And it's really hard. So not that I know anything of what to do with that, but it just really helped highlight it. And then, you know, action items that we kind of talked about were like larger scale. I guess we decided that now I have to get a PhD so that I can use this and understand how we can create models for people who have immigrated here, or specifically Spanish speakers, or, you know, something along those lines. And then also that I can probably talk to my clinicians who are, you know, mostly Spanish speaking therapists, and kind of figure out what they've been doing that works and have this conversation with them as well. For them, you know, I was born and raised here, but some of them weren't. And so I think, you know, pulling from some of their knowledge and stuff might be helpful to help everyone else. So I don't know. That's where I landed.
That was very insightful. Thank you. And yeah, we're not taught those things, and we're not taught to question and understand. We're struggling. We're not understanding why we're struggling. So it's kind of important to understand that. So thank you for sharing. We have time for one more person if they want to share. Or we can just go ahead as well. I know that Zoom thing is weird. I feel like when it's in person, it's so different, but you know, COVID world. Okay, so I'm hoping that your kind of conversations together were insightful, and that idea of taking time to process this information, taking time to learn and unlearn, that Gloria, I think, so that Gloria discussed was pretty cool. So you need to kind of sit with yourself and be like, okay, this is what I learned. These are the practices. How can I reframe them? And how can I further dismantle where they're coming from in order to kind of process things? Another disclaimer. So I'm going to share with you some decolonial methods into practice. These are the things I found helpful from the article, but it's kind of a thing that you can interpret as you like. And it's kind of a thing that is not really set in stone. It's how you can do it. So let's see. All right. And you can see my screen well? Perfect. Thank you. All right. Okay. So the first thing is the idea of acknowledging power dynamics in the client-counselor relationship and minimizing this power dynamic. It's very common, and it's kind of known that in the therapy room, you have the power. You're the person with the higher power, and it's important to acknowledge that dynamic and kind of try to minimize it. First, ask for informed consent around session topic and modalities. Ask the client if they want to talk about this, if they're okay and if they're comfortable with this specific modality. initiate conversation around how you want to build your relationship based on needs and values. How would the client like the relationship to look like? And then be transparent about your intentions for asking particular questions or introducing particular modalities. So are you asking those questions for specific reasons? What makes you want to ask those specific questions to that specific client? And then kind of try to refrain from stating your own beliefs or perspectives as a fact. Just because this is your belief, or just because this is what you learned in grad school as the quote unquote psychological way or the quote unquote science of psychology, it does not make it a fact. And so when you actually offer any of your hopefully minimal perspectives, give them as offerings. They're things that clients can take or leave and have them ask for clarifications. And then you can always ask for feedback with the questions. What has been working for you? What hasn't been working for you? Is there anything I can do differently? Is there anything I can educate myself further on? Oh, someone says I can't hear you. Are people having the same issue with not being able to hear me? Okay, maybe if you can leave and rejoin, hopefully that helps. Sorry about that. I don't know, but everyone else can hear me? Yeah, okay. So if you can leave and rejoin, maybe that would help. Sorry about that. And then just try to educate yourself on what can you do to further support the client and actually ask the client those questions. At the end of the day, the client does know best in a lot of things. Oh, sorry, I didn't recognize that they wouldn't be able to hear me. Thank you for typing that comment. Okay, all right. So acknowledging the power dynamics within a client-counselor relationship and minimizing. So these are some ways to acknowledge. Something else you can do is try to recognize the limitations of Western counseling psychology, which primarily focuses on the individual and family of origin. So as we discussed before, as that table kind of discussed, understand how that could be limiting. So go bigger, recognize what are the cultural, societal, ancestral influences that are including oppressive systems? What can we think about deeper than the idea of the individual and the family of origin? And then relatedly, try to differentiate between cultural competency and anti-oppressive practice. This could also relate to the definitions I talked about the difference between inclusion, diversity, equity, and anti-oppressive practices. So you have to take the time as well to learn about your clients' cultural influences, as well as the oppressive influences that your clients and their ancestors continue to navigate or have to navigate. What is the history of your clients' people? How are they oppressed? What are the different influences they're having? So it's not just about acknowledging this client is BIPOC, this client of a specific cultural background. It's also acknowledging what have they and their ancestors been through in order to get to where they are today and what is still affecting them. And then be transparent. Be transparent about your own identities, your own privileges, your own lived experiences that you do or do not have, especially when asked. For example, when I first introduced myself and I talked about my different identities, I have some privilege in some aspects and I don't have privilege in other aspects. For example, I'm an immigrant, I'm BIPOC, I am Arab, I'm Muslim, but at the same time, I'm financially secure. I have some things that a lot of people are not in that position. I know that worst case scenario, if I lose my job, I'm going to be able to live. Other people don't have that. So understand that just because you belong to a certain background, just because you belong to a certain identity, it doesn't make you not privileged in other ways. And kind of understand how those identities of yours intersect. So recognizing their importance as a counselor when clients are trying to assess their sense of safety. Finally, all those DSM diagnoses, all those simple DSM stuff, take them with a grain of salt. Recognize that Western counseling psychology usually pathologizes normal, appropriate responses to oppression and trauma. There's been a lot of work that I really wanted to include, but I didn't have the time on PTSD and how Eurocentric it is, and a lot of things regarding that. So ask what diagnoses or labels the client resonates with and feels empowered by, because this is going to make a lot of difference. And you have to understand the cultural implications. You have to understand the effect of oppression and trauma. Just because a person is angry doesn't mean they should go to anger management classes, especially if there's a lot of racism involved. So kind of think about that and think about where that's coming from. And why are you feeling like your first response is, oh, let's take that person to anger management classes? Based on what did you make that decision? And then finally, allow for flexibility and fluidity in modalities when working with clients. Recognize that a lot of popular modalities in Western counseling, such as, in my opinion, CBT, they weren't created with BIPOC individuals in mind, although many of them are rooted in ancestral BIPOC wisdom and practices. So also recognize individual choices as well as systemic limitations. So kind of see how all things are interconnected and how clients can make an impact on the larger society. The last one is supporting clients through cultivating a practice of self-care, building a network of community care, and advocating for institutional care. So that was a lot of word vomit on my end, but I'm hoping that these were helpful in kind of trying to see how different therapists or how other therapists are trying to incorporate some decolonial practices and incorporate that into therapy. And it is something that should be on your end to research and should be on your end to understand and what you can personally do. So I just want to see what kind of reflections we're having. This is the end of the presentation on my part because I wanted to let some time for discussion. But what are you guys leaving with today? We had a lot of very heavy information. We had a lot of history. We had a lot of definitions. And it's kind of like a really content-based. But I want to leave it to you. What can you leave with, whether from dismantling what psychology means and how it was kind of created and into what are some practical ways to have decolonial practices? What are you leaving with today? If you can write in the chat box, open your mic, that's cool. This is also a time for questions if anyone has any.
Wait, can you folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just keep getting the sense of like how important the therapeutic relationship has to be like a partnership, and less like, ooh, I'm the therapist, I'm coming from this position of power. I'm going to stand on my soapbox and tell you exactly what you need to do, because there's a lot of, I don't know, there's a lot of like incompletes there that might like jeopardize the relationship. So it's like, again, partnership, you learn from each other to try and figure out like how to progress together.
Mm-hmm. That's very true. This is very true and insightful. Thank you for sharing.
In the chat box, Erin shared a recognition that so many aspects of community-based work is based in non-colonial practices, person-centered care, flexibility approaches, etc.
That is actually very true and very interesting that you pointed that out. Thank you for that. What other things are people reflecting on? So think about everything. Feel free to type in the chat box if you're uncomfortable with talking, but I want to have some kind of conversation. Okay, Larissa is saying topics are universal. I'm coming from an educational background, or there's so much overlap between the topics you shared and the ones we're discussing. That's pretty cool. Would you be able to elaborate a bit on that if that's possible?
I just wanted to share that Larissa wrote in the chat box, thank you so much, Zainab. This has shown me that the topics are universal. I'm coming from an educational background and there is so much overlap between the topics you shared and the ones we are discussing in our profession as well. Erin shared, Larissa, you can hear, I'm so happy.
Perfect, thank you. And that was very interesting to hear about. And I'm really happy that you can hear. I'm so sorry. I hoping you didn't miss out a lot. But that's very interesting. And what might be interesting to you is one of the presentations is about, on the Columbia website, is about decolonizing scholarship. And that might be really, really cool to kind of think about and to understand how scholarship is viewed and how we can kind of dismantle it. And based on what are we deciding studies are valid, or based on what are we deciding studies are publishable, quote unquote.
Katie shared, I would really love to learn more about a non-colonial approach to addressing trauma and anger, especially about oppressive experiences. And then Larissa shared, can we think of the world as one big ball that we all live on and need to share?
Katie, there is this really cool research studies on trauma PTSD and decolonizing PTSD. I'm gonna I'll have them to send them to you guys in an email. Let me write that down, and it can be really, really helpful in that. With that said, this is still kind of really new to so many people, and there's so much more that we need to do, and there's so much more research and so much more kind of work regarding it. So if anyone has any resources that they feel like are beneficial that they can share with the group, please do so. At the end of the day, I really am very new to this. I really don't do a lot of, I need to do more, as we all need to do more. So it's kind of the idea of it's all up to us. And then I see, can we think of the world as one big, yes, please. That's very interesting. Yeah, borders are arbitrary, but that does not negate the pain.
Then Sophie, I have a course to share, so please stay on while I get the link.
Perfect. Thank you, Sophie. I appreciate that. Does anyone have any other questions or reflections? I want to be mindful of time. I know a lot of people would usually have clients at once, so I like to leave like a 5-minute leeway between different meetings. So I want to make sure we're giving people the time to kind of process this and relax and, you know, have time before their 1 p.m. because I know with telehealth, everything's after each other. Sophie, thank you for sharing that link. That sounds really cool. I'm going to check it out. Thank you, I appreciate that. And these are resources, if anyone would like some resources. Thank you. All right, so I'm guessing this is the end of the presentation. I hope that you guys learned something and I hope that it was beneficial. Please feel free to send any other questions in the chat box. I'll get the list of resources and I'll forward them. And I'm really hoping this was beneficial. At the end of the day, I want you to remember and to make sure that whatever kind of knowledge you're absorbing, you need to reflect upon it and you need to understand where it's coming from. Who said that this is the knowledge that you need to learn and dismantle it on your own, just as today's presentation should be. Thank you.
If everyone can please, if you can have the opportunity to please unmute and give Zainab a round of applause. We are just so grateful to her for presenting today. Thank you. And I want to encourage all of you to please join us for our next CEU event, the Red Cross Mission and Volunteer Opportunities by Sydney Helston. It's going to be held on Wednesday, March 16th from 12 to 1. And she's also going to be going over a few techniques to help you with being able to support clients who are experiencing crisis and also how to support clients who are experiencing natural disasters. So again, I'm so grateful for all of you for joining us today. If you have any questions, please feel free to chat them in the box or send me a message. I'm always happy to respond to them as I'm able. And I hope all of you will have a great rest of your day. I'm just going to stay on until 1 o'clock in case anyone has any questions. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.